All right, Jackie, thank you for those songs. It's been a good worship service. We had a good Bible study. See everybody here this morning. We do have visitors. Thank you for coming. It's been quite a busy week for everyone. I hope everybody's good and awake and alert. Reminded of the guy that was preaching one time. He looked out over his audience. There's a guy sleeping there, and he looked at the guy beside him sleeping. He said, hey, you want to nudge him, get him awake? And he looked over at him and said, you go ahead and wake him up. He said, you're the one who put him to sleep. We'll put anybody to sleep today. We've got enough on our plate, but it's good to see you. Good to see you and be in a time when families do get together, and thus the visitors that we have. All right, let's get into the book this morning. Let's turn to Acts chapter 17. I want to lay the groundwork for the lesson this morning. I want to begin reading in verse 1, in fact, and read a few verses of Acts chapter 17. Now he says, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, and there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to the people. And when they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. He says, and Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. They stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. And when they had received a pledge from Jason and the others, they released them. The brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. Now, in these verses, we catch Paul during his second missionary journey. In chapter 16, he had spent some eventful days in Philippi. And then here in chapter 17, he makes his way about 100 miles southwest to the city of Thessalonica, which of course is another important and influential city in Macedonia. And as the Scriptures reveal to us, and as was his custom, he spent 3 weeks, 3 Sabbaths in the synagogue reasoning from the Scripture. Now when you look at verse 4, there seems to be a reasonable amount of success here for Paul and the disciples. Not a whole lot, but it looked like there were some conversions. There were some that were convinced, but not all of them were. In verse 5, some of the Jews were very unhappy with the teaching, with what was going on, what was being brought by the disciples. And it's interesting to me that instead of countering with Scripture, instead of opening up and let's discuss the Scripture, they resort to carnal tactics to go against the disciples. And they go into the marketplace and they get some pretty unsavory characters, and they get them all together. They form a mob, and they set up, they set the city in an uproar. And they evidently go to Jason's house where they thought Paul was staying. He's not there, so they end up dragging Jason out, and they take him before the authorities. And there's this huge uproar. And the brethren realize that it isn't safe for the disciples. And so by night, they send them to Berea, where some interesting things happen there. But this morning, I want us to particularly concentrate on what Luke records for us in verse 6. A specific charge against the disciples. He says, these who have turned the world upside down have come to our city also. Now I know that Jordan touched on this verse last week, but I want to look at it maybe at a little different angle. What do you make of that charge? When they say that, what do they mean by that charge? What is Luke saying that here they're upsetting the whole world, and maybe more importantly, is the charge true? That they actually were turning the world upside down. Were they guilty of that? Were they guilty of turning the world upside down? Well, and through all, was it a bad thing that they were doing that? And a few questions like that. I want to answer those questions because I think as the disciples were accused here in Thessalonica, perhaps for us, as we live our life for Christ, as disciples of Christ in this community, some of these points may help us. I want to begin just examining the charge. And on the outset of the charge that Luke records, I think there is an important admission that we all need to admit. That as you look at these men and you look at their work and what they were doing, what they were preaching and teaching, I think we must certainly admit, at least from one angle, that the charge is true. That what the people, that the mob was saying, what they were saying about the disciples was true. Paul and his companions and the work that they were doing, the places that they were going, when they went there, it's certainly a true charge. They were upsetting the world. In fact, I don't think anyone would be surprised, especially not the Lord, because the Lord anticipated these things would happen. Notice what he says in Matthew chapter 10. This is exactly what Jesus said would happen. Matthew chapter 10. Notice verse 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. But beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. You, he says, will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles, he says. But when they hand you over, do not worry about how or what you are to say, for it will be given to you in that hour what you are to say. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. And children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name. But, he says, it is the one who has endured to the end, Jesus says, that will be saved. What did the Lord tell his disciples to anticipate as they went out and did the work that Jesus said to do? He said, look, you're going to be arrested. You're going to be put before the authorities. You're going to be hated. You're going to be beaten. Family members will betray each other. These things are all you're going to be hated by everyone. You're going to suffer persecution. Everywhere you go, trouble's going to follow. There's going to be trouble where you're at. That's what the Lord says. And I would suggest to us, as we look at the book of Acts, as we just begin, and I'll just do a brief summary here, that what the Lord told them here, that is exactly what happened. As you look at Acts 4, as soon as Acts 4, everywhere they went, there was trouble. In fact, after Pentecost in Acts 2, and really that's where it all started. On that day, when 3,000 people obeyed the gospel of Christ and were added to the Lord's body, the blood-bought institution of the Lord was established on that day. And they went out. Peter and John in Acts 4, they were arrested right off the bat. And they were brought before the authorities. And some of the things that they said about the resurrection in the temple, they were all questioned and they didn't like it. So in Acts 5, all the apostles are arrested. All of them. The very next chapter, they're all arrested. And then what happens, the authorities, to make their point more emphatically, they just go ahead and give them all good beating. Then in Acts 6, Stephen is standing before some Hellenistic Jews, and he is saying some things about the Lord, about the law, and about things. And then, well, let's drag him before the Sanhedrin. And then we know what happened to him. In Acts 7, they kill him. And then you look, in Acts 8, we hear about the persecution that Saul is bringing on the church. He's killing a Christian. He's making arrangements to have Christians arrested. And in some cases, he's making arrangements to have them put to death. And then in Acts 9, we read about Saul the persecutor becoming Saul the preacher. And then when he does that, enemies come upon him. Listen, we're going to have to plot and figure out a way to kill him because now he's converted. And then you go to Acts 10 and you think, well, all of this resistance, all of this trouble that's going on the outside, surely on the inside, where the Lord's people are and they're assembled and the church, things ought to be going smooth. That's not so. We've got a Gentile now to deal with. What are we going to do with these Gentiles that want to be Christians? What in the world are we going to do with them? So there was questions there. And then in Acts 12, Herod kills James, and Peter is arrested again. Chapter 13 begins, Paul begins his journeys up through Galatia. And in chapter 13, he's persecuted. He's driven out of that city, driven over to another city. And in Acts 14, he's there. He's among the crowds, and he does a miracle. And the crowd says, hey, we need to worship him. He's the greatest thing. And he nips that and says, no, sir, I'm a man, and I'm not God. And so they just drag him out of the city. They're going to stone him. And they stone him. They think he's dead. They've stoned him. Leave him for dead. Then in Acts 15, there's more controversy in the camp about what we need to do with disciples or Gentiles, circumcision. And then we go to Acts 17. There's this, or 16. There's this girl that is possessed by a demon. There's people making money off of her and the ability that she has. And Paul cures her. All right, performs a miracle and casts out that demon. And that means a loss for the guys that were making money off her. So they said, we're going to kill, we need to kill him. He's ruined our income. And so they have him beaten, put him in prison. And so then he leaves, and then when he's in prison, Acts 16, remember that? The earthquake, the jailers converted, all of those things. Well, what trouble. They're turning the world upside down. They're upsetting everything. And that's just a brief look at what's going everywhere they went. And so the charge that was made, I think, is true. I think it's a true charge when it comes to being a disciple of Christ. Everywhere they went, it just seemed like trouble followed them. It's just a fact. I want to suggest to you that on the surface, that somebody that is just, you know what, I've heard about Jesus. Yeah, you're supposed to be good. That this kind of summary, that this kind of idea just kind of strikes the Bible student as odd. I'll say that. With what Sawyer read about the titles that the Messiah was to have. The Messiah was to have all of these titles. Did you hear it? Among those titles, the Prince of Peace. The Prince of Peace. Paul in Ephesians chapter 6 says, those that are following, verse 15, following the Prince of Peace, we are to preach the gospel of peace. Wow. Think about that. The followers of the Prince of Peace, preaching the gospel of peace, would cause so much trouble everywhere. That just doesn't seem like that's lined up. That doesn't seem consistent. And that brings me to the question, why is that? Why did that happen? Why is it like that? The gospel of peace, preaching the gospel of peace. Why does preaching the gospel cause so much trouble? Why did it cause so much trouble for them? Think about that. We need to know the answer to that. Because I think that preaching the gospel causes trouble. And so let's look at some answers to that. What happened in the first century when the gospel message was being preached? Number one, I think the reason that it caused the trouble that it did, number one, is that the first thing I want you to notice is that the message of the gospel was an exclusive message. It was an exclusive message, distinct. It was a message like no other. Nobody ever heard this message. I think if Paul had been willing to go out, and as he taught and then preached in the temple, to create an impression, and just think about your life and how you deal with people. To create an impression that Christianity wasn't anything more than just maybe a little addition to Judaism. That you know what? It's just a new sect of Judaism. And if Paul would have been willing to take some of the teachings of Christ and blend them together with the old law or with the customs of the Jews, especially the ones that they held in high esteem, if Paul would have took the church, the teaching, the message, and if he would have just said, you know what, I think there are a lot of like. We're just going to blend them together. And you know what? I think this is going to be just fine. Do you think that he would have had the problems with the Jews that he did have if he would have had that message? That we're just going to take Christianity as well as Judaism, and you know what we'll do with this? Let's just blend it together so we can all get along. Do you think he'd had the problem that he did? Or when he went to those pagan cities and all the idolatry was there and the idol worshipers were there, and if he would have introduced God as a God, not the God. Listen, this is just another God. And you look at it and you say, you know, you can just add this to all your list of gods in the pantheon. Just put him in there somewhere. And it's interesting that you have all of these gods because I've got a God to talk about. And we're just going to put him in with all the rest and we can all get along. I just don't think that the idolaters would have raised up like they did if Paul would have taught about Jehovah God that way, just a God. Just like your gods. Problem was that was not the nature of the gospel. The gospel is not an inclusive message that includes all kinds of religious systems. It is an exclusive message, and it excludes every single religious system that has ever been devised by man. It is exclusive. I want us to see that. John chapter 14, verse 6. Jesus says, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. Now, when Jesus said that, he says, I am the one and only way. I am the one and only truth. Do you know that a partial truth is a lie? Do you know that there are people teaching all kinds of partial truths and then holding it up as the whole truth? Jesus says there's only one truth. It's the whole truth. Anything less is a lie. I am the truth, the life, the only source of life that you're going to have spiritually is going to come from Jesus. That's what he's saying. Now that is an exclusive statement by the Savior of man. And in case anyone missed what he was saying in those 3 points, he says nobody. No one is going to be with the Father. No one is going to see the Father except through me. Did you get that? Jesus does not say, I am a way. I am one of those paths that you can take. He didn't say that. No, his message is an exclusive message. I am the only way. I am the only path. And I look at that. There's no other way to heaven except the one that passes through me. That's exclusive. And you'll notice when he says that, what does he do? He excludes paganism. That's out. You can't worship Zeus anymore. That's out. The goddess of Diana, that's out. There's not going to be any more of that. And when he says that, he excludes all Judaism, all the old law. That's the path that you can never take again because that path does not lead to heaven. I lead to heaven. That's what he's saying when he says that in John 14:6. Judaism was the law of shadows designed to bring us to Christ. But now we're under a new covenant, a new agreement. The law is out. Judaism is out. Notice in Acts chapter 4, the apostles would echo that teaching. When Peter and John was arrested, notice what he says. Acts chapter 4, and really Peter's making his defense. Verse 12. And there is no salvation, he says. There is salvation, no one else. There is salvation in no one else. For there's no other name under heaven that we have been given among men by which we must be saved. No other name, no other authority has been given. All the things that we do under the authority of Christ, whether by word or whether by deed. This is where we find our authority for the things that we say, do, and teach. No other name given, Peter says. and you look at that, can you see the exclusive nature of the message? Can you see it? Can you see that it is exclusive, the message of Christ? You cannot be saved and go to heaven any other way except through Jesus Christ. Not through paganism, not through the Old Testament system. You're not going to get there. There's no way you're going to get there. That says, it's what this message says. Every other path is rejected. Every other path is wrong. Well, how do you think that went over? How do you think that went over to the Jews? How do you think that went over to the pagans? How do you think that goes over to the religious people of the day? Would that upset someone? You think that might, but I want to tell you something. This book says that there were some that accepted it, embraced it, and obeyed that message, while there were others that rejected it. And not only rejected it, but rejected it in a hateful, mean, violent way. It upset them, made them mad. I'll tell you what, you go out, you preach and teach an exclusive message, this message, I can tell you right now, get ready. Conflict will be inevitable. Inevitable. We like to all tolerate and get along and just everything's nice. No, sir. Not from what I see. Not from the exclusiveness of this message. That people are going to get mad. And out of those ones that get, somebody's going to listen. There will be those that accept it. But there will be those that violently reject the exclusive message of the gospel. Well, something else. Not only do I believe that they got so much flack because the message was not only exclusive, but when the gospel message was, it's a message that demands radical change. It is a message that demands that each one of us take a look at our lives and radically change our lives. It is a message that says you are not going to feel good about where you are right now in your life. It is a message that says I need to take a look at my life and I need to make changes in my life. Radical changes. When you hear the exclusive message of God, it doesn't say, well, I feel good now. Thanks a lot. That made me feel great. It ought not. And you know what? When people heard that, what was their response? How'd they feel about that? It upset them. It made them think. The gospel demands that the followers of Jesus examine their life, and it demands that they put themselves at a higher level, a higher standard than they ever have. And to know that standard, it calls for radical change in the lives of the people that receive this message. For those of us who have half-hearted religion, who can come here or not, who can live out there as a Christian or not, a little bit of the world, a little bit of Jesus, you know how it is, shake it up, everybody's happy, nobody gets hurt. Jesus would say in Matthew 10:37, you've got to love me above anybody else. And you must love me above any relationship that you have on this earth. I am the first. You love me. And in a world that is overwhelmed in materialism, Jesus would say in Matthew 6:33 that you need to put me, my kingdom, my righteousness before anything that you own, anything that you have, anything that you can put your hands on. You need to put me before everything else. That's radical change. You ever thought of it that way? In Matthew 19:9, Jesus would speak to a culture where divorce was epidemic. He would speak to a culture where divorce was epidemic, and he would say to them, when you say I do, I expect it to be until death do you part. Radical teaching. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, beginning about verse 9, Paul would list a whole list of immoral behaviors. And he was speaking to the Las Vegas of the ancient world. And he would, at Corinth, and he would impose these strict moral standards on them. No fornication, no adultery, no homosexuality. It's all contrary to the will of God in a culture that commonly practiced all of those things. He would say that. Jesus said, you're not going to have that. You're not going to do that if you follow me. Higher standard. And I demand you follow it if you're going to be part of my kingdom. The Lord said radical and revolutionary things. He said radical and revolutionary things about the marriage relationship. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. In a world where a wife was just property, just a piece of property, Peter would say that husbands are to consider their wives and honor them as what? Fellow heirs to the grace of life. And Paul wrote how we ought to love our wives and husbands, how our relationships in marriage ought to flourish and grow and develop. It's the greatest relationship you'll have on this world with someone is your marriage. The message called upon people to really, I guess, go against learned cultural instincts. Do you know what that is? You know what a learned cultural instinct is? That you put yourself before anything else. You know what this message said to do? You think about somebody before yourself. You're not first. Somebody else is first. Somebody needs something that you have. Give it to them. And somebody that you consider your enemy and you hate, you love them. You supply them. That'll heap coals on their head. You give them what they need, and on top of all that, you pray for them. Pray for your enemy. Brethren, when the disciples went out and preached that message, it was unheard of. Now, I want you to appreciate with me that it upset the apple cart, that it turned the world around. They couldn't hear, and I just don't feel good where I'm at. Well, I don't want to hear that. What are you telling me that? It challenged those to move to a different place. It challenged those to move to a higher standard. It challenged everyone to change their life. Some did, some embraced it. Some did. Some lived the new life and appealed to that standard. But a lot rejected it. A lot hated it. And then again, the Lord said you ought not to be surprised. There's a reason for that. There's a reason that's happening. Look at John chapter 3. John chapter 3. John says in verse 19. Jesus says this, "This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God." There's your answer. The light's coming to the world. What light? Jesus. What light? The Lord's message. This exclusive message is coming to the light. Why do men hate it? Why? Because their evil deeds are exposed. And exposed not for approval by the world, but exposed as disapproved by God. The things that men do in darkness, the light exposes their evil deeds. They don't like it. Men don't like that. That's the reason. That this exclusive message that people hate, that demands change, that demands that you stop doing this, the light exposes your danger, exposes your evil. Oh, we don't want that. Put out that light. Shut that message up. Most resisted it, sometimes violently. Why did the gospel stir up so much trouble? It was an exclusive message. Jesus is the only way. And also in that message, it was a radical message that demanded that you have a different life than you're having now. People don't want to give it up. They like their life, like the world, like the worldly life. We're not giving that up. I don't care what you expose about me. And they hate that about you, that you expose that about them. The gospel created trouble because the gospel was going to do this. It was going to go into all the world. Now I think about the gospel and I think about the message, and understand that these great truths were never ever, the plan was never to ever keep them in secret. And the plan never ever was to have our little clique here of the only ones that knew it and heard it. The plan was for these great truths to go into all the world, for everyone, not stay hid in some secluded part of Jerusalem. No. That's why Jesus said in Mark 16:15 to go where? Into all the world and do what? Preach this message. Preach the gospel. And that's why he said in Matthew 28:19, go out, preach the gospel, make disciples in every nation, or of all the nations. Now we've got a problem. Because this message is not going to stay in some secluded place, some secluded sect. No. It's going to start at Pentecost, and it's going to go out into all the world, and the goal is for every person in the world to be touched by the gospel of Christ. That was the plan. That's a problem. Early disciples took that exclusive, radical message, and they preached it and taught it to every single person that would listen to it. It wasn't only the message was exclusive and radical, but it was going to be preached everywhere. The world was going to hear this. We weren't going to keep it hid. And I'll add this to that, that on top of that, they preached it with courage. When they were challenged, they didn't cower down in a corner and hush up and we don't want to offend anyone. Tolerance is the key. No, sir. They came out fighting. Arrest me, beat me, put me in prison, kill me. This is the will of God, and I can tell you it's going to be preached. That was their attitude. Remember Acts 5 we mentioned? When the apostles all were arrested, they were drugged on the carpet there before the Sanhedrin. Peter courageously stands up and says that in verse 29. We must obey God rather than men. You guys want to jail us, kill us, beat us? We're going to preach this. We're going to teach this to all that will listen. Wow. When the early disciples were forced to choose between the loyalty of the Roman Caesar and Jesus Christ, many chose the Lord. And what happened? They died. They were killed because of that. A message that is radical, demanding change, exclusive, taught by courageous men and women that was going to go everywhere in the world. I suspect that something like that, it's going to turn the world upside down. And in all of that, I want to tell you something. That was not a bad thing. That's what the gospel does. That's what the gospel does. So, what's that say about you and I? I think about the charge. These have turned the world upside down and have come here also. It makes me wonder. It makes me wonder today. Would anyone say that about disciples today? Would anybody charge that? Would anybody in this community look at this group of disciples and make that charge about us? Would they look at you? Would they look at me? Make that charge about us? You know, I look at that whole scene and what we just kind of surmised. And really and truly, all the pieces of the puzzle are there. They're here. And I look at it, and we're still preaching that exclusive message, the message of the gospel. We're preaching and teaching that. And I would add that the cultural circumstances between Rome and Sandyville pretty much the same. How many books you read about Rome and America looking alike? There's more to come. And what's happening out there, I can tell you, I can just take you to Rome and show you the same things. And guess what, brethren? It's getting worse and worse every day. So we can really make the parallel, can't we? I think we can. The only part of the puzzle that's missing is, do we have disciples in their part of the world, in your part of the world, that has enough courage to take this message to the people that you know? Do we? If we do, if you do, you're going to shake things up. You're going to upset some folks. You're going to upset the world. In a world that says, now listen, we've got some truth here, a little bit of Jesus, a little bit of instrumental music, a little bit of Lord's Supper once a year. We've got some of it. We're all the same. It really doesn't matter what you do or believe in a world that says that. In a world that says, one religion is as good as the next. And in that kind of world, do we live in that kind of world? In a world that says, all religion is equal, really, on an equal basis, and accepted by God on an equal basis, we're pretty much equivalent. In a world that says sincerity is what it's all about, and faith is what you need to have, and God will take care of the rest. In a world where we live like that, in a world that we live in, people are going to get upset when somebody says, that's not true. That's not right. That's not what this book says. People aren't going to like that. In fact, one religion isn't as good as another. People aren't going to like that. Do you know there's only one church? That's what this book says. One body, there's only one baptism. People don't like that. They're going to get upset when you tell them that. Do you know that there's only one way to be saved? This book instructs us how. People won't like that. And in fact, if you reject that way, you're going to be lost. People won't like that. Do you know when you tell somebody that, they're going to get upset? They're not going to respond in kind right off the bat. Did you know that? In a world that believes that you should never, ever speak against somebody's religious conviction, oh, you can't do that. It will upset people if someone stands up and says, what you're doing is wrong. It is not according to the message. It's not according to the book. It's not going to be accepted by God. Every single religious teaching of man is going to be rejected of God. There's only one way, one truth, one church. You're going to upset some people. In a world that believes that morality is whatever you decide. In a world that believes that you can't say nothing about what somebody's doing. That morality is relative. And you should not speak against anybody's behavior. It's free choice. When somebody says something, it's going to upset somebody. In a world that says that if you live with someone before you're married, it's wicked and sinful. It's wrong. You're going to upset somebody. It's not wrong because I say it. It's wrong because this book says it. In a world that says homosexuality is just an alternate lifestyle, this book says the homosexual will burn in hell. I didn't say that. This book says that. Now, when you say that, you're going to upset somebody. Dishonesty, lie, cheat, steal, all of those things that are accepted when you stand for truth and right, and it's contrary to the morality that's written in this book, and you actually stand up and say it. We have disciples that are doing that. We cower down. Are we just going with the flow? Going with the world? Eating everything that they're giving us every day to the point that we're so sick we'd like to vomit, but we can't? Today, New Year's coming. I challenge each and every one of you, I challenge myself to be faithful to our mission, to be faithful to this mission, to preach and teach the gospel of Christ, to recognize it as an exclusive message, to stand by His truth. Do not cower down in the face of adversity, no matter what the reaction. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, the life. Turn the world upside down. He says, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. That's the invitation. If you're here this morning and never done that, you want to turn the world upside down? You want to turn your family upside down? You want to turn your friends and neighbors upside down? Do you want to upset them? Do something unique. Obey what God says. Obey what God says. He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. Please come. As together we stand and sing.